And we're
We're
back.
back. I guess how many times will we say that? We'll have to come up with like new ways to say we're back, you know?
I mean, I think it's the perfect way to say it because we are back. I mean, sue me.
You know what? I'm being optimistic that we'll have somebody binge watching or binge listening, the show. And they're gonna hear we're back 3 times in a row. So
Yeah, yeah,
our
yeah.
bar is higher. We'll see you next episode with a new way to say that.
But at least this time we have a name. Welcome to The Shortcut with Jack and Greg.
Yeah.
That's this show. We've decided on it. It's your favorite show now. Congratulations.
Wow. Very optimistic.
You gotta hype it up, you know?
Yeah. And I think I think today, like an interesting, maybe very fitting to reveal the name of the show today, because we'll be talking about kind of the intersection of like content atomization and repurposing, which, as I'm sure like many teams have been discussing, it sort of relies pretty heavily on short form, and we'll get into sort of like when long form to short form makes sense and when actually the reverse, I think, makes sense too. Also, I suppose it's somewhat of a shortcut. It's somewhat of a growth lever for video. It's like a really important thing to explore to get the most out of your video. We've sort of touched on that a couple different times, but never really gone like super in depth. And so that is today's episode: content atomization and repurposing. And maybe the first thing we need to start with is like, what's that ampersand like doing in there? Like, what do we mean? And like, I think for a lot of people, they assumed they were the same thing. I would say even up to a few weeks ago, I kind of assumed they were the same thing, or one was like a synonym of the other. How about yourself, Jack? Did you fall in that camp, or like did you kind of think like this was marketers coming up with new terminology, or were you already ahead of the game there?
No, not ahead of the game. I think I think repurposing has been like this buzzword for so long. But I think it's sort of an oversimplification of like the true experience of creating content for every different platform. It's it makes sense, what it means, but like it in some ways neglects the truth of the matter, which is that like in pretty much most pieces of content, when you're taking and putting different places, it's not the exact same. And so I think it's definitely a newer term, but like definitely rings true to the experience of content marketers.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I think like breaking those two terms down, I would say content repurposing is more popularly used. It's probably the term people are more familiar with. It's probably also what marketing teams are like pursuing first. They're probably doing this maybe more often. But to separate the terms, content repurposing is kind of like taking an existing piece of content that you've already made, and I would say like adapting it. Like in some cases that could be trimming existing sort of footage, or actually taking whatever the end product, like whatever the actual content is, and sort of just reworking the material directly. I think though I would sort of include like medium to medium repurposing too. So taking a video, transcribing it, and then like lightly editing it into a blog post, I'd also kind of file under repurposing. But pretty squarely, it's like taking an existing piece of content and then like form fitting it to another channel without major revisions, really keeping most of the final product intact, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then content atomization is taking sort of like the idea with a larger theme from a piece or a point of view from a previous piece of content, and then turning it into like a whole new asset.
Yeah.
So this is really not using anything other than the core sort of like concept or the core theme or the core like message you're trying to get across, and then using only that really as the foundation, and then having to like tailor fit, really create something new or original for some other place, right?
Yeah.
And I think like, there have been polls from kind of marketing based companies, asking marketing teams like, do they use both? How do they split their time? It definitely seems pretty consistently like repurposing is both with what a lot of teams start with and it also ends up being where they spend like most of their time. which I think makes sense. I think we can kind of get into, later on in the show, like where there are some instances where repurposing is maybe just adding extra work and not a lot of extra value. We can get into that. But I definitely think like a lot of teams look for repurposing first. I would say the good news though is that like doing repurposing and atomization well sort of rests on like the things that you should do really benefit both. I mean, I think that there are some, sort of tactics that work especially well for repurposing, but a lot of the like groundwork that we think that you should do to have like a great repurposing or atomization strategy, it works for both. You're not going to sort of do that groundwork and then realize like, oh, this doesn't really work for our approach to atomization, right? It only works for repurposing. So that's something to consider. It's like two different things, two different terms, definitely in the same kind of umbrella of like getting more mileage out of content. But a lot of the fundamental strategy work will benefit both. I think in our opinion. So
yeah, definitely. I think also there's a sort of like you were talking about, like this is sort of it's not a new concept. Like obviously people have always been atomizing, but I think with this emphasis on repurposing content, like I think more teams have relied maybe too much on repurposing, and like atomization is coming back into the forefront of the mind. I even like feel like I can sense that like in our own company. At Kapwing, for instance, we make videos for YouTube, tutorials and things. Someone on our product team was like, why aren't we posting those videos, like clips of those videos on TikTok? And my response to that was like, I actually feel like the same content would be better if we just refilmed it with like a different like sort of mood, a different pace, different opener, things like that. And so I think like now, I don't know, I think maybe in some ways a lot of people who aren't in marketing specifically like feel as though repurposing is the only way, but I think it's actually atomization is maybe more useful most of the time. And so I think, knowing when to do which, obviously atomization takes more time generally than repurposing, but knowing when to like pick your battles and when to go the extra mile and create an entirely new piece of content, I think is like definitely a consideration that more people are starting to do.
Yeah, and I say like you bring up a good point that maybe we can explore a little bit later around like we're very lucky in that within our marketing team there's a lot of trust built up around sort of our strategy. It's pretty transparent. People know what we're working on. We get ideas coming in from the rest of the company, like you just shared, but not a ton of like outside pressure, like outside of marketing to do this, that, or the other. And I know, a lot of folks are going to relate to like when you work at a startup, it's a lot of times like executive bombs, idea bombs is kind of a phrase I've heard people say, which is like the exec drops an idea and people have to sort of scramble to react to it. Or in bigger teams, I think it's more sort of like team-wide pressure, content teams getting pressure to do something because someone from sales has the idea or someone from PMM has the idea. So anyway, I make that point just to say like having like a repurposing and atomization like strategy is really important because right now, much more sort of, I would say like mellow economic climate than there has been in the past 2 years or so. We've touched on that lightly too, but I think one thing that's affecting is like people, teams and leaders are asking about repurposing, sometimes not knowing what their team is doing, sometimes not knowing really what to suggest, just sort of having this idea of like, we would like to get more out of the money we spend on content and on the in-house employees. So how do we do repurposing, right? And so if you don't have an answer for that, repurposing can kind of, I think it could end up being one of those like Slack bombs, those ideas that show up in Slack, someone with authority says it or asks about it, or frankly just says that we should do this. And if you don't have your strategy kind of collected, now's a bad time to be on like the back foot to kind of answering those or like responding to that, right? So not something that we've like personally experienced. Again, I also think we try to be very transparent with like our plans, which helps. But right now is a great time to be ready to answer like what is our repurposing strategy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways we are figuring that out ourselves right now. We've sort of, at our own company, made it a new goal to like put out X number of videos on our different social platforms per week. And so I think that speaks to the priority of figuring out this strategy and also like evolving that strategy all the time. And so I think like, yeah, as I've been saying, like, I think atomization is taking a larger portion maybe of that strategy than it used to when repurposing. Like people were I feel like there was a time where people were expecting like, you could just take your video, like you could just take your YouTube video and post a little clip of it and like it'll do huge numbers. And I think
if only.
Yeah, and I think like some of that thinking has died down a bit. And sometimes that's true, but you have to be very careful to know or like decide when that is true and useful. Yeah, so I think it's a good topic to talk about today and dive deeper into. So excited to talk.
Yeah. And I think like like you said, like we like to kind of just relay back like how we're approaching things, something we've learned from like a past experiment, and not be so kind of like abstract or conceptual. So I would say, yeah, like for today's episode, I really love to discuss like how we're viewing repurposing and atomization. I think for simplicity, I might say repurposing and kind of have that catch both of those terms. I know kind of in conflict with previously defining them. I know, but to not maybe say like whatever 4 to 6 syllables every time, we'll do that. But yeah, I would say like a couple of the principles like we sort of worked on before just like getting into repurposing every single thing. Where one, I think a really important one is we spend a lot of time workshopping like themes and points of view. And so I think this is really important to do and something that frankly I may have even done sooner or wanted to have done sooner. Even if you're actually planning on sort of more one-to-one repurposing, right? Like strictly reworking existing content and not too much atomization. And the reason I think that like themes and points of view, and I'll get into what, I think that those are, is that like repurposing is not just about, this is going to sound very corny, just like grit your teeth. Like we'll get through a more precise explanation.
Let's go.
Yeah. It obviously like all marketing, it can't just be about reach. It has to be about resonance too. Like you could end up causing yourself problems by reaching more people with the wrong message. Now that's almost like marketing work you have to kind of like undo or will have a hard time undoing. And now people believe certain things about you or your product or associate you with things that just don't matter. I mean, even net neutral, it might just be like, it does nothing for you. So you've reached someone, but it doesn't matter. Right. So what I really mean with that is like, the messages you reach people with, they need to be something of substance, like something that your audience will like react to. Everybody knows that. That is still true. Because I do think a lot of, companies will create these narratives that like they're great from the product or the company's perspective, but there's just no substance to them. Like there's nothing for the audience to like discuss or there's no emotions elicited, right? So that's number one. They have to have some substance, some meat to them. The second is I think is like they have to share or teach your audience something that helps make not only them better at what they're doing, but it makes them more informed when they show up to try or buy your product, right? Now, Jack will probably laugh at this one because I think I probably have like beaten this example into the ground. But one that I often reference is like specialty food items. I think highlight like how important it is.
Classic Greg anecdote.
You're like, here it comes, the spiel we've all heard. But I do think like specialty food items hold up as a pretty good example. The one that I like to give is like not a ton of people, I believe, are sort of showing up at your everyday random grocer and picking up a sort of super specialty kind of off menu for most Americans item like bone broth or something like that. They have like gone through a journey already by the time they reach that shelf. That probably looks something like, well, I saw something about how bad processed food is for you, and that led me to reading about ancient diets or paleo or something like this. And then I read, I try to think of a book that was in the space. I think like Deep Nutrition is a book that's about that kind of stuff. And then they finally like showed up, in the aisle where bone broth is, and they buy it. So the reason I share that is because I just think it's one of those examples that like it's easy to imagine it in the physical world of like, yes, of course I don't show up in a grocery store and buy random items that like I've never bought before, right? Something has to lead me to getting there. And it usually happens like outside of the grocery store, and it's non-product. It's like
Yeah.
actually my point of view, my opinion changed about something, and then I showed up to the product, right?
Right.
And it takes me back to, and I can't remember where I first heard of this, but it's this idea that like the easiest way to like sell a solution is to somebody who's bought the problem. Problem could also be like opportunity. It doesn't necessarily have to be like literally like a problem or an issue, but it's like the solution really only makes sense to somebody who like, they get it. They share the same point of view. They also feel like, yes, I need that outcome, or yes, I do have that problem and I agree with you. And then the solution makes sense, right? And I think that, that's a very roundabout kind of point of discussion, but I do think it matters for repurposing, because if you don't nail down what those messages are, you're going to turn on this machine that repurposes content and messages and narratives, and you could like exponentially or at least meaningfully increase your reach. But if it's all the wrong message, it's sort of like for naught, like in a way. So I think like it's really, really important before you kind of turn the repurposing engine on, is to figure these things out. And for us, like this did not really feel complicated. It took some work, but for us, this really meant like, what are some things that we believe about the world of video creation and video marketing, that we feel like would not only help our customers be more successful in their roles and with their goals if they also believed it. So if they believe this as well, it would give them an edge. What do we believe about that? And also, do these beliefs, like, do they help them understand why Kapwing is the best product, or the product that's like best situated to help them achieve their goals? Because not only do we like believe in these things broadly, that opinion like shows up in the product, right? So I'll stop there. But I do think like we could get into like a whole other probably episode about this concept. But I do think, before you really, before you start taking, or rather making a huge investment in repurposing with your time, I really would figure this out. Even if it's a bare bones, simple, pick 3 narratives, unpack each narrative with 1 or 2 additional points of view that are a little bit more precise about things that you believe, and then start, versus like being successful with repurposing, getting all this additional reach, and then realizing months or weeks later, like, oh, we reached all these people with the wrong message. Whoops, can't take that back.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I feel like that goes even, of course, beyond this episode, and it's just like a trap marketers fall into generally, I think, is marketing the product rather than like marketing the sort of like writing the story, and like instead they're just sort of just marketing the ending, which like isn't good enough. You're not going to buy the book because of the ending. And so I think that's a good point. I think you could really like take that anecdote and use it for anything in marketing, kind of, but I think people forget to do that specifically with repurposing, because it especially is so easy now. I feel like, maybe 3 years ago, it was not as easy to actually repurpose. Like people didn't even really know how to, like sometimes people didn't even really know how to
technically
take a horizontal video and turn it vertical. And so like that was kind of enough at first. But now everyone knows how to do that. The content is getting like, there's more and more short form content. There's more and more atomized content. You kind of have to, place a little more effort into short form, and like, don't let it be an afterthought, or, do a half-assed version just to get a short form video out there, but like actually anticipate how it will be received, which I think a lot of people have not been doing for some time, because it's so easy to make short
Yeah.
form content now.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's super important. You're right, and with the ease of like with it being so easy to sort of like technically handle the repurposing of something, like again, and not to pitch our product, but like instant accurate transcriptions or resizing and stuff has gotten way easier, like just simply flat out. Yeah, it's just so important to have these in place to just not go off track. I think another like way I think of it is like, if you're using like recent or older ideas, to brainstorm, and you have this kind of lane here that's like, if our messaging is in this bullseye, it's like accurate and it's things that we want to say. Well, you could put something out that's like off target, and then later on you're using inspiration from that old idea for new ideas, but that idea was already off target. So now you're getting like further and further away, versus like if you had your narratives picked out from the jump, anytime you brainstorm anything, even if it's net new and you don't know what the repurposing approach will be for that piece of content, you could just decide pretty squarely, is this stuff that we talk about or we should talk about or not? Like, is it in or out of bounds? Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, super important. I will say though, to get into more of kind of like the tactical, like really getting into the meat of repurposing, I would say the second way we're thinking about it, or the second sort of principle we have, is like, we want to build like a system. I would agree with you, Jack, that we're not there yet. But we want to build a system for repurposing and atomization. And when I say system, that can mean so many things. I think what really matters is just that we want to have it codified, written down, how, like which pieces of content are sort of our anchor pieces, like where a lot of the ideas have like first contact with like customers in our audience. And then where do we repurpose? Like, how consistently do we do it? What do we make? Like, really just almost mapping. I think like a map is actually a better description of like what we'll ultimately end up with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we kind of start with these mediums to get the idea out there, whether it's like long form for ideas we have a lot of conviction in, or short form for ideas we're kind of testing. Like, we're trying to see what people's responses are to it before going even further with it. And then like from there, again, like I would prefer, and I would encourage people to probably map out their approach to repurposing in an overly precise way. Like, I think it's better, and I think we'll kind of commit to this idea that it's better to be overly precise with your approach to repurposing and then call audibles when you need to, than to be too vague and then to basically come in every week with your repurposing strategy, your repurposing system being not all that helpful, because you don't really, you're still left making a ton of decisions about like what to do with where do I take this, Yeah. So yeah, I see sort of like the final artifact, the final piece of work from this like building a system, work that we're going to do behind the scenes is like going to look like a map. It's going to have the content channels where we sort of start with most ideas, and it will really, really clearly spell out. And from here, we're going to take these ideas to these platforms in this way. And then I think the other thing to call out is, again, like highlighting both ideas where, like, what's the pathway for ideas where you have really high conviction, like just stuff you firmly believe in, you don't really feel like you need to test it. Although we definitely, like, even with those ideas, we do, like, based on the audience's reaction, we might pivot the messaging, right? So I don't mean test like in the sense of like you're not going to take in feedback and make the messaging better. I just mean like you have conviction that like there's some core truth to this that you need to get out there. And like having those, for us, like those ideas will start with like long form because we're confident in them. So we so believe in like repurposing and atomization being important to video. We're doing a podcast on it right now. We're not going to test this idea. We're not going to like temperature check it. Like, we just believe our product is built around this, right? So here we are. But for other ideas, they might be a little bit like, they might be around the bend. We're not actually super sure. We think that these things might be helpful for our customers to know about, to hear about. We might even incorporate some of this stuff ourselves, but we're not sure. So we would instead start those ideas with short form. and
Mm,
see how it goes. So
yeah.
I think that's important to call out, just because like so many people think long form to short form first. Makes sense. You can take a long form piece and get a lot of short form out of it. But the reverse is, it's just as important, I think. Like, actually, we're going to make something short and sweet. And then if this idea proves itself out over time, that's enough evidence to make something long form, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely. It reminds me. I think of TikTok, and sometimes I feel like a lot of these like super viral TikTok songs that come out of TikTok are actually like just a verse, or just the chorus
Yeah.
that someone's made of a song that is not finished,
Yeah.
and like it blows up, and immediately you're like, okay, I need to turn that into long form because now I know people love it. I know there's an audience for it. And then it takes, a month or a few months before these artists then release like the long form version of these songs. I think it's
Yeah.
very easy to like understand in that scenario. And I think you could definitely do the same thing with content. I think a lot of people, we've talked about this before on the show, podcasts are sometimes, a lot of people feel as though they're like the most difficult pieces of content to grow, because on podcast apps, you don't really have algorithm help. They take a lot of work to record. If you're editing them a lot, they take a lot of time to edit. But you could you could challenge yourself to do a 10-minute, YouTube video, even though that's still long form. But, it's still a short form sort of podcast. And then once people like it, then you can extend it as long as you need. If you're getting advertisers, you want it to be longer, like all that can come with your needs. But I think a lot of people forget, that like you can start in a way, like the quality shouldn't be lower, but with like lower effort content, like content that takes less
Yeah.
time to record, less time to edit, things like that, and then and expand from there. And I think you're exactly right. Like everyone knows that you can take long form and turn it into short form, but people don't often do the opposite. And I think that's probably where a lot of like creator burnout comes from, is when you're making these long form, series or something, and people aren't biting, and you would have been a lot better off just doing a few TikToks and then seeing how it goes and then moving on if it doesn't feel like there's promise.
Yeah. And I really like the music metaphor for that, because I think this is why I think like it works especially well as like a metaphor, because I think to actually do this in music is a little bit tougher. I think that there's like definitely examples of this, but like in marketing, we're so lucky in the sense that like we can test just the equivalent of a chorus, like let alone testing a single from the album. Let's say the album is like the idea fully realized. We don't even have to test a single. We can just test a chorus, like just a single, tightly scoped, tiny idea, put it out on social. It costs, if it's just text, it's going to cost almost zero effort other than to like do the writing, obviously, that you need to do to frame it in like a sentence or two, and just see how that lands. Right. So I think that's great. I think that metaphor also works with like, if it's an idea concept that you're truly bought in, like it's a bet the company idea, it's something that goes beyond marketing, that's like really inherent in the product. Probably you've got a little more backing, I suppose. Or at least I would have a little bit more conviction to like start with long form and then say from here, let's unpack this idea further with the short form.
Yeah.
Whereas, if something's kind of ahead, it's a little bit ahead of what your product does. It's a little bit ahead of the team being like fully confident or having full conviction in the idea. It's awesome to test short form.
Yeah.
And one quick anecdote for people who are sort of wondering, well, like what is like an example of that? Like what's an example of like testing an idea that's ahead of what you believe? Actually, from my days at Shopify, I actually heard this as a story because it happened a little bit before I showed up. Was that the Shopify blog and social media played with us this sort of fulfillment model of like print on demand, like well before the product actually had any like serious kind of integrations and stuff for print on demand. For those that don't know, print on demand is sort of like you upload and add custom designs, and then those products, whether they be t-shirts, mugs, whatever, you work with a supplier who will send out those products as they're ordered. So you're not actually sitting around with a huge stack of inventory waiting for them to sell. They just sell on demand with your custom sort of designs and stuff. And so, yeah, like the blog and social media really like went out way before the product made any changes, kind of testing the waters of print on demand. There was a great reaction. And then obviously I think folks know from there, like both like drop shipping and print on demand became things that were previously like really baked into Shopify. Like it made Shopify was a great platform to do that stuff. So that would be like one example of like, hey, we think this could be something, like we think it has there's some substance here. We're not so sure it's maybe kind of a new thing, and we're not ready to kind of like bet the product on it or like bet our full positioning on it, but we want to just test the waters, right?
Yeah.
Great way to do
now
that.
I feel like you see like every like, grow your wealth in business influencer, all they talk about is drop shipping now. So it's like,
yeah,
clearly that went well. Yeah.
For sure. So that I would say is like building out that to kind of instant replay, all that we talked about there. I think like just mapping out, where are a lot of the ideas you're going to put out going to start, where you're kind of like, if you have a single, we've talked about anchor mediums before, if you're going to have a single anchor form of content like a show, or if it's going to be your blog or whatever it is, that's going to be where most of the ideas make first contact. You're going to sort of go there first, then spell out how you're going to repurpose those ideas from there. And then also just consider, where does it make sense to do long form to short form for ideas you have a little more conviction in, and where does it make more sense to actually go short form first, see if there's some legs to that idea, and then go long form. I think if you have a simple map that really just plots that out, that is like your repurposing system, right? And it helps really clear the air about like, how do we do repurposing? It's like, well, check out this graphic or this Figma file, and that's your answer,
Yeah. So go ahead and release that chorus, release that single. Let's see what people think. And I think this is exactly right. I think short form, like we've been saying, but again, it feels so obvious now that like you bring it up, but yeah, it's like the best mechanism for testing content strategy. But yet so many people only use it as an afterthought to already post what has already been made. I think there's definitely some missed opportunity there, and would definitely encourage people to approach short form with a eyes full of wonder rather than like just putting what you already have there.
Yeah, it's it really does, like long form to short form really banks on the long form being right.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. It's not to dissuade anyone, but it's like, if you're not sure that it's right, if you're not sure that the ideas are something you really stand behind, that really, really makes sense for your company, it's better to test short form.
Yeah.
And I would say one other like sort of addition before we jump to the next, I think like part of our approach is, in your system, it actually probably would be good to very simply define like, hey, when we report on like our marketing, if you're a small team, or sort of like our content marketing, if you are a content or social team, it'd be nice to kind of run your calendar or set up your telemetry in such a way that you can show the impact that repurposing had specifically, right? So this could be as simple as like, this is always hard to prescribe a solution to because people use different analytics tools, they have different calendars and stuff. But I would say like, if you have the content pieces that go out labeled as repurposed, or if you have some sort of way, especially for on-site content, to specifically pull up a little dashboard or to show contribution from content that got remixed in some fashion, that's awesome. I mean, especially with what we just said before about companies are looking at repurposing to try to make those dollars stretch. This will not only sort of like, this is not only really like the right thing to do for any marketing initiative that's going to take time and effort, right? It's also a really smart thing to do if you feel like you have a sort of hunch or a thesis about how well it's going to work and really want to prove that later. So if the repurposing asks are coming in hot and heavy, and you think actually it's maybe moving your team away from activities where you should be spending more time, and repurposing should be perhaps a part, but not as much as people are asking for, the data helps make that case. Or if you feel like, hey, no, I think this is a great growth lever for us. I actually need more resourcing to help out with repurposing. Of course, this is a great way to prove that, as long as the numbers like tell that story, right? So yeah, well, we won't make this an analytics episode or anything, but I would say, like, if you're going to build out, like, how are we going to repurpose the content, it might be good at the same time to just figure out, like, well, how are we going to measure net new versus repurposed? If you can do it in a simple way, it's great. If it's going to take insane data lift, like, obviously simpler and simpler is like better for teams that are strapped for time, but know what kind of case you'll have to make, or know what kind of proof points you'll have to have, and then make sure you have them. It's definitely different for every team. So
yeah, and we've definitely seen that at Kapwing before as well. I feel when we were first doing, I was actually hired to initially do TikTok, and TikTok did pretty well. We had definitely some like viral moments, even once talking about the product, which like obviously is, awesome when you actually get to mention the product in a video that like goes viral, and it's not like a cringe a cringe way to talk about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, but I don't think we actually had solidified like what our goals were with TikTok. And so we were like looking at link clicks in bio, and like those were abysmal. And so
Yeah.
even though we were like doing pretty well and growing quite a lot on TikTok. And so I think yeah, definitely like before you put in too much effort, getting that nailed out of like what does success look like to you, because I don't know, I think in both ways it goes both ways. On one hand, it's very easy for companies to just be looking at like vanity metrics and only care about views, but like maybe that's not actually impacting the business, which obviously is not great, especially if you're like a very small company and you don't have too much effort to, stretch too thin. On the other hand, you can sort of look at content as well, short form content, and say, well, that didn't get me like direct, upgrades or purchases like, Google search does. But maybe that's not a great indicator of success as well. So,
and I think like a big red flag would be like, so we have some, you mentioned we have some output goals that we would like to hit, but if that's all you have, or if that's all that's been passed down, that's a red flag. Your repurposing is going to face some troubles, almost like without question, if like output is the only thing that's sort of like driving it. Like for us, our output is tied back to, we would love to see this level of contribution to our North Star metric, the metric that marketing carries as a team, that's beyond like platform specific, or it's not like some operational thing. It's something that's very, very close. Like we don't have a sales staff, so it's not sales ops, but PQL is like product qualified leads. It's a great indicator that we're adding the right people. We're getting the right people to try out Kapwing. So if you don't have goals outside of output, it's fine to have output goals. It's fine. I think people come down too hard on sort of like having output metrics. Like they're totally fine. They're a great leading indicator, and you're not going to reach the outcomes without a certain amount of output, right? So they're fine. But if that's all you have, especially if that's been sort of like mandated, like that's been sort of like dictated to you, like you must hit these output goals that came from outside of marketing or the head of marketing with really no questions around impact, you're going to be in for some trouble. So definitely push back and try to insist on some way to like measure this, right? Rather than just like cranking out more and more content, because you're going to go from like one content treadmill to another. You're going to go from the net new treadmill to the repurposing treadmill. So if you can't measure impact, it's going to be a tough time.
Okay, so yeah, short form's great, repurposing's great, amortization's great, but when does it actually suck? Sometimes it can be a waste of time. Let's just be honest. I think that's something we've sort of been getting at throughout, is that while it can be really useful and often, underutilized, and people aren't utilizing it in the way that is actually helpful, like through experimenting, a lot of people are maybe overutilizing it, spending too much time on repurposing, when it's actually not helpful. I think we should bring up maybe some some moments where that's the case, so marketers can look at themselves, hear this, and look at themselves in the mirror and say, like, have a heart to heart with themselves and say, is that me?
That happens every December during investment planning for me. So, but to get it to happen the rest of the year, yeah, no, it's a great question. Like, I would say, yeah, kind of in giving like lightning round style answers here. Like, the number one, and it's a bit of a repeat, but the number one is just like when you have no other groundwork done for repurposing, don't do it. Don't start repurposing content when you haven't done like any of the foundation work, which to me would be some mixture of like, what are the messages we want to get out there? Like, what are our themes? Like, what does our telemetry look like? Can we measure this? What do we need to measure? What kind of metrics matter for this? Like, what are we trying to move the needle on by doing this at all? And then also like zero work done for the system. I would say, I suppose you can always build the plane on the way down, so to speak, of like, you can always kind of figure out and really tighten up like your themes and narratives as you go. I don't think those have to be like really super crystallized at the outset, but I think like not having that system like in a rough draft state really is rough, because it kind of like starts to, in the long term, like work against you. So if you just don't know like what content you're going to take and turn into what, and you're just kind of coming in every Monday with like, how do we just randomly cross and cut up stuff? Like it just feels like the content treadmill in a new flavor, right?
Yeah.
So, you can survive probably with all of this stuff not being in a great place. But if you are literally at square zero, you have none of it across across all three of those things, and maybe some others I'm not thinking about. Probably not right to just like jump into heavy duty repurposing.
Yeah, completely. Mine perhaps is more, it's, I guess, a mixture of technical and kind of obvious, but it's like, if you're going to half-ass it, don't do it. There is no sin to me worse in short form content than when someone takes a horizontal video and posts it still in horizontal mode and only uses like this much of the canvas instead of the whole thing. Or if there's a conversation with someone and you're not, going back and forth between the two people, adding movement, things like that. If the camera's stagnant, or, just straight up adding in like a long piece of content and not doing anything at all, like not making highlights, just posting a podcast you made an hour long and like, I don't know. To me, it's a sin. It's like, just spend a little bit more effort to show the best parts, to crop in, to make sure you're showing people who is speaking. It's like these very, very simple tasks that can sometimes take a while, frankly, except developments with AI are going to make this easier. But yeah, to me, like that's the sin, is like really repurposing, but like not even going hard enough to like actually even resize. I think it makes me mad.
Yeah. I hear you on that one. Yeah. It's no, that's rough. It's like again, I think a lot of times when you see that, it comes from the place of like, orders on high came down about we need to hit some sort of output thing.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
an impact wasn't a part of it. Like, I think that's almost always the symptom, or the team kind of like, the team kind of, they kind of made that mistake themselves. So if it's not an outside pressure, it's the team pressuring themselves to do something like that. Totally agree. I would say in a very similar vein, like, and again, most of mine are going to tie back to what we kind of discussed more broadly, but I would say on this like XY axis of like kind of confidence in an idea, your conviction for an idea, and then like how much you've tested it. Like if you're low on both, it's not time to repurpose. Like if you both do not have high conviction in an idea, if it's not something that's like really at the heart of your company or what the product does, and also you've never tested it in a short form way, or like you've never even sort of you've never even taken a temp check for this idea, don't turn on some repurposing engine for this concept. Like it's not the time. It would be much better to just say, we're going to like really, really narrow the scope and do a tweet from the brand account or the CEO's account or something, or we're going to do one blog post and that's it, and just see how people, how they react to that. So I don't think you need the experimentation and the testing, again, if you have really high conviction in the idea. And then the learning is like, or rather the experimentation is more so like, what do people say? And can you sharpen that message further? Or maybe you really do truly learn something and you make a more substantial pivot. But I think it's fine to be wrong, but just be like high conviction and wrong. Don't, have a plan to, do like a dozen different videos on an idea that no one really truly believes in and you haven't even tested yet. Like, really, that's not the time for repurposing for that kind of content, right?
Yeah.
So big swing and a miss. Definitely avoid that one.
Yeah, stop it. Stop it.
We like reprimand our listeners here. Great.
Yeah, that's you.
But don't.
Don't. Yeah, but otherwise, it's a good idea. Give it a shot.
Whatever you want to hear.
Yes. Very cool. Well, thank you guys for watching yet again, The Shortcut. Hope you guys like that name. Let us know if you do. And yeah, we're here every week. Make sure to come back for next week's episode. We're always talking about marketing trends. Yeah, Greg.
Yeah,
it's been real.
It has. And I will say, like, if anybody has or wants to share something about their repurposing approach they think is like counterintuitive, or they feel like not a lot of people are maybe following or we haven't seen before, would love to see that. Even if you just email me personally. Love talking about this stuff, Jack. I know you do too. So anybody listening, if you've got approaches that you think should be more widely known, we'd love to hear it. We'll love to see if we could help with that too.
Absolutely. All right. We'll see you guys in the next one.
All right.
Later.
Take care.